fortunate things. Excellent. We're going to record the meeting, partly in case we will say important things and it needs saving for posterity, but also because there are some people who couldn't be here tonight who've sent their apologies and were keen to kind of pick up on the discussion later. So if you don't want to be caught in the recording, then obviously you might want to turn your camera and microphone off, and we'll move into discussion. I'm hoping, because I want to pick your brains on some of these topics. And at that point, if you don't want to speak, this sounds like doing a seminar. If you don't want to speak, you're welcome to put a comment in the chat. I won't be able to see the chat, so I'm hoping that Kate or Alan or Brenda will be able to tell me if people have popped things into the chat. So that's the first bit of housekeeping. The second bit of housekeeping, which is very important, is to thank you for having me. It's lovely to be back here speaking to the Eastwood group, a return to Eastwood, and a very international Eastwood it is, and it's lovely to see familiar faces. One of the things of the last couple of days, as I've been trying to pull together some ideas for today, has been correspondence with a number of Lawrence scholars, and it's lovely to see Keith, who I picked up contact with, who obviously reviewed the Rachel Cusk, an excellent review of the Rachel Cusk in the Lawrence Journal. Jonathan's here, who reviewed the Frances Wilson biography that we might want to talk about. And Lee Jenkins, I didn't think could make it. I think she was the reviewer of Annabel Abbs's book, about which we'll maybe also take a slightly more problematic book. One small but significant apology, which is that I've only really managed to move away from the administration of student support and the marking of student essays in the last 48 hours or so. So much of what I'm saying today is quite provisional. It's early in my sense of this new project that I'm working on, which is about the structure of feeling of Lawrence. And I'm particularly conscious that there are the people in the room, and particularly people like Lee Jenkins, who I've already mentioned, who've been working on these sort of questions for some time and have come up with some very interesting and important contributions. I'll talk about Lee again in a moment, and the things that she's done with Richard Aldington and HD and Lawrence, and how that is very suggestive for the ways we can think about these new kinds of fiction and these new kinds of writing. So that's by way of apology, which also opens up how I'm going to perform today, which is that I'll speak for what I hope will be around half an hour, maybe a little longer. And then I'm very keen to open this up to questions and to discussion and to comments from those of you who've read some of the things, some of the novels, or some of the other texts that I'll talk about. Because as I say, I'm starting out on this project. I have research leave from the University of Nottingham, so this is something that I'm hoping to work on more in the coming weeks and months. Excellent. So, what are we going to talk about? I'll start with thinking about structures of feeling, which Alan mentioned. One of my more recent publications was an attempt to explore the structure of feeling of modernism through the relationship between T.S. Eliot and D.H. Lawrence, which was a relationship that kind of obsessed me over a number of years. In fact, it was an obsession that was to do with trying to find out when and how they met, because I'm sure that they did meet. But unfortunately, I couldn't prove that they did, which rather undermined my essay. So I had to write something slightly different. But what I did find in researching that was the extent to which Eliot particularly was, I don't think it's too strong a way, it's a word almost, I forget which word to use, but he's almost obsessed by Lawrence. In the 50s and 60s, he talks about how surprised he is by how much time and attention he'd given to Lawrence. And he's wondering why did Lawrence have this force that kind of drew me back to his work, drew me back to thinking about him, and also to arguing very strongly with him at the same time as sometimes acknowledging his immense importance and his contribution to modern writing and thinking. And I think that that centrally, Lawrence and Eliot were both very importantly concerned in the 1910s and 1920s with an articulation and understanding of contemporary experience and the formal innovations with which they're both associated, as well as the thematic moves forward, the things that they could talk about as well as how they talked about them, were very important and led the way into our own modern period. So structure of feeling was an important way of bringing together that thinking about Eliot and Lawrence. It's a term that comes out of Raymond Williams originally. The term structure of feeling was the way Raymond Williams wanted to talk about his own contemporary moment in the 1950s. He came out of the army in the early 1950s and rejoined an academic career that had been interrupted by the war. And he reports, in fact, might be in the late 40s, early 50s, he's standing with Eric Hobsbawm in the Cambridge English faculty or in a lecture somewhere, and they look around and Williams just says that they're speaking a different language, and he feels this sense of being alienated from in which he finds himself. And he then talks later about his struggle to get his relation to the tradition right. He wanted to understand how his own experience coming from a Welsh mining valley to Cambridge and then to become an academic, how did that intersect with what was going on in the university, how people were talking about novels, how English literature was being studied. And what he found was that the only way that he could talk about that experience was by talking about Lawrence himself. I see a note in the chat that the sound is distorted. Is everybody finding that problem? Okay, maybe I'll just change earphones in case it's...
Yes, very distorted.
Okay. Okay, is that any better? Could people hear me? Oh.
Yes, okay, that's great.
Right, I'll move on. So Williams was trying to understand his relation to his contemporary moment, and Williams being something of a thinker, he conceptualized that experience. He conceptualized his understanding of the contemporary moment with this idea of the complex or structure of feeling. And what he did was to look around the experience that he was having, the books that he was reading, the things that seemed important in his time. And he identified the things that were new, the things that were radical, the things that weren't quite comprehensible. And his eye was very much caught by Richard Hoggart's book, The Uses of Literacy. And he writes a very important review of Hoggart's book, where he's talking about how weird Hoggart's book is, how strange it is as a combination of documentary, of kind of fictional writing, autobiographical writing, and literary criticism, bound up also with history. And he says that Hoggart has confronted some serious formal and technical difficulties in his writing. And Williams thinks that this sense of difficulty, both that Hoggart had as a writer and that Williams was having as a reader, were indicative of the particular pressure point or change in his contemporary society. And in trying to understand what Hoggart was doing, Williams turned to Lawrence. And he said, Lawrence is the person who in the realist novel has been previously exploring these questions and issues. And had Hoggart had the courage of his convictions, maybe he would have written a novel. Oddly enough, Richard Hoggart had tried to write a novel and thought it was awful and put it back in his bottom drawer. But what I find interesting there is that there was this pressure in Williams in trying to understand what was new, what was this emergent structure of feeling. He turned to Lawrence as the point of comparison and example, because the experience that Lawrence had had, coming out of a working class background,
coming into a highly educated system to a different social class, trying to explore and explain that experience through the novel form, he thought set an example for Hoggart. Another way I might think about that same structure of feeling, winding back still further, is there's a lovely article that John Worthen wrote about women in love, and it's called Madness in Women in Love. And if anybody else in the room has read this article, then they get a prize, because it's in a not a well-known journal, and it's from 1975, and it's a journal called Trivium. And John writes in that article, short article, about the madness. Okay, I've got another message saying inaudible. I'm sorry about this. Is this inaudible for everybody? Or can people hear?
I think it's just a bit quiet for some people. I
can't do much about the volume. Kate, you're...
Yeah, it's just a bit quiet, that's all. But it's fine for me. It's just a bit quiet.
I can't hear you, Kate. I don't know. Maybe this is my settings. Let me see if I can get to some.
The girls do it better.
Am I completely inaudible?
Not completely.
So volume up. Maybe this we can manage. I'm sorry, I'm coming all the way from Berlin, so it's a long pipe. So getting back to John, I'll try and speak louder. Getting back to John Worthen's article about women in love. So John talks about the madness of women in love, and he talks about representations of madness in women in love, and how in its contemporary reception, contemporary readers of Women in Love were utterly perplexed by this novel. I couldn't understand it. It was like, why are all these people so weird? Why are they having these extraordinary representations of psychic trauma and psychological suffering, and what's going on in this novel? Much in the way that people reading T.S. Eliot were kind of perplexed by The Wasteland or by Prufrock around about the same time. And in one sense, this is what avant-garde writing does, what experimental writing does. It pushes us out of the things that are familiar, out of the things that we recognize, into new spaces, into new thought adventures, to take Lawrence's term, to new tremulations, as Lawrence also says in his, when talking about the novel in the Goldsworthy essay, I think it is. So here we have John Worthen talking about madness, and that really interested me, was the idea that one of the things that people get accused of when they write things that are radical and challenging is being in some way mad, and that what Lawrence was doing was exploring that limit of where conventional normative behavior and conduct and thinking about life tips over into something that's considered excessive, extreme, irrational. Remember Foucault's history of madness, which in French is the history of reason and folie et déraison dans l'âge classique. It's this association of madness and unreason in the classical age. So it's about this opposition between what's reasonable and normal in society and what's unreasonable. And Foucault tracks this through literature. He tracks it through great and exciting and perplexing works of literature. That's where we find the limit of what's rational and acceptable in our contemporary society. So he too is sensing that the emergent is explored in the literary, and the literary asks us questions. It asks us questions about how to read, about how to understand our relation not only to the text that we're confronted with, but also the life or the moment that we're living in. And to flip back to Raymond Williams, that complex of things is what we might talk about as the structure of feeling of a particular period. And it's fair enough to talk about that historically. It's fair enough to talk about that in terms of the emergence of modernism. But how can we be conscious and aware of what's happening in our contemporary moment? Because that was the amazing thing that Raymond Williams was doing with his concept, was to say, how am I going to piece together a way of understanding what's important in my contemporary moment? How will I know what's important? And in some ways you can't. But what Williams did say was, you look for these things that are strange and disruptive. You look for these things that are radical and are challenging some of the things that we normally assume. Which is by way of a long kind of conceptual introduction to how we're going to talk about these texts. We have, as you know, Rachel Cusk's Second Place. We have Annabel Abs's Frida. We have the monumental Tenderness by Alison MacLeod. And just for fun, I've also mentioned my thing, just for fun, we have Francis Wilson's Burning Man. There is a novel that I'm very sad to say I haven't read yet, which is by Mariana Tugovnik in her novelist mode, which is called The Novelist's Wife, which is also exploring Frida Lawrence's experience. And there is, of course, John Worthen's wonderful text that combines the story of Frida and of Ernest Weekly. But for today, I'll try and concentrate primarily on Cusk and MacLeod, but I'll also keep those other texts in mind, just from the suggestion that they all seem to embody or to enact or to engage with the same challenges, the same problems, that they're part of this structure of feeling in the way that not only are they concerned with something that's urgent, something that's new in our contemporary society, but they provoke similar critical challenges and critical questions. And I'm going to make a stab at defining some of those challenges that they offer. I think, and I should put my cards on the table right up front, that I think Rachel Cusk is by far the most interesting of these texts in terms of the formal and technical experiment that she's engaging, that she's undertaking. I think the Second Place leads on from her really quite remarkable and brave trilogy, which was Outline, Kudos and Transit, a remarkable series of 3 novels that they'll maybe have time to talk a little bit about too. So Cusk, I think, is profoundly self-conscious about her place in a literary tradition, in a canon, and about her work, if you like, of trying to represent new ideas of character. In fact, she talks about being beyond characters. She's lots of echoes of Lawrence's feelings about getting out of the trap of a bourgeois or a 19th century realist idea of character. She does remarkable things in trying to, in the Outline trilogy, effectively efface the character of her protagonist or her narrator. It's a remarkable series of books where the protagonist, the main character, Faye, is basically in the situation of a woman in the contemporary world, taking an aeroplane to Greece to work on some seminars. And she's repeatedly confronted by predominantly men who talk to her. She sits on an aeroplane and a man starts talking to her. She sits in a cafe, some man will walk up and start talking to her. There's this experience that leads into an experience even of violence and of threat, but it's this sense of being in a woman in the world where you don't control discourse, where you don't control your position and even the organization of your selfhood in the world. I say I'll try not to get drawn into talking too much about what she's doing there, but it is certainly about exploring what it is to be a woman in the 21st century, what it is particularly that's different and that's new. And to get back to that self-consciousness about what she's doing, she relates herself very closely to 3 writers, really, maybe 4. She relates herself to Lawrence. She writes a very interesting introduction to Lawrence's Rainbow in 2011. And she's, even before that point, made very clear that Lawrence is one of what she refers to as her mentors and friends, somebody that she's continually in dialogue with and impressed by. She talks about Doris Lessing. She's got a very interesting couple of pieces of writing where she explores how Lessing utilized and exploited Lawrence's example. That early in the 60s, we think obviously of the late 50s as Williams, Hoggart, David Story, Sillitoe, the working class male writers. But the extraordinary impact of Doris Lessing's Golden Notebook particularly, but also her previous two Rhodesia novels, can't really be exaggerated. Lessing moves well beyond the formal achievement of the working class male writers. And what's again really interesting is that her attempt to represent the fragmentary, broken nature of women's experience necessitates a problematic, how would you say, dislocation of the form of the novel itself. So the Golden Notebook, for those of you that don't know it, but I strongly recommend reading, has a central character called Anna Wolf, who is a writer who can't write. And she buys herself 4 notebooks and tries different writing experiments in each of those books, and tries different ways of thinking about her relation to writing and to the world, and particularly to her experience of her life at that moment in the late 50s, early 60s in London. That fracturing of the narrative involves imagining herself as a character. It involves certain periods in the writing, this intense stream of consciousness writing. There are multiple different voices that are all Anna Wolf's or Doris Lessing's voice in that novel. But she's also somebody who is completely saturated in a knowledge and a reading of D.H. Lawrence, that she's exploring how she can inhabit some of the important, if you like, challenges or revelations that Lawrence has made about women's experience. And this is a line that that Mariana, but also Carol Siegel, Lara Fiegel, other writers pick up, that there is a tradition of women's writing that comes out of Lawrence, that endorses and engages with Lawrence's effort for this, which is more important than the suffrage, as he says, that's his battle for the exploration and understanding of women's experience. So Lessing, another key figure for the way that Cusk thinks about the need for a different or a new form to articulate experience in the 20th century. So we have Lawrence as a key experience, key canonical figure for. We have Lessing, and perhaps less explicitly, she has an engagement with Natalia Ginzburg, the Italian writer, about, again, whom she speaks very warmly, alongside Françoise Sagan, Bonjour Tristesse, and a particular tradition of French women's writing. So there's something very international about the cast of characters that Rachel Cusk is drawing together. And in talking about each of these, she's always concerned with the technical achievement of the writing. She's concerned about how the moral perspective of a narrator or a protagonist is embedded in the language and in the structure of the text itself. That Lessing's fracturing of herself to allow commentary upon herself is an important way of thinking about the contemporary woman's experience. And as I say, she draws heavily on Lawrence, and in some ways looks up to Lawrence as a kind of commencement point for the kinds of writing that interest her in the modern period. So why do I think Cusk is so important? I think she's important because she becomes, in some senses, an avatar for what people are talking about as metamodernism. In the university these days, there's now new discussion about what it is that's happening in contemporary writing. And one key aspect of contemporary writing, as we'll talk about in a moment, is autofiction, and the other is how autofiction intersects with or overlaps with ideas of metamodernism, which are a writing that absorbs the lessons of modernism and postmodernism, but moves beyond them and comments upon them as you go. So there's a sense of an extreme self-consciousness of form that's taking place in these texts. So that's already to say that Rachel Cusk is self-consciously a part of an emergent form of writing. For those of you that are thinking about this emergent form, you might think about Knausgaard's My Life, you might think about Ben Lerner. There are a number of writers that take the matter of their own day-to-day experience and narrate it at often great and complex length. And this is a movement into a new understanding of the resources of fiction, if you like. And Cusk is interested in that, because the other thing that we find about Cusk is how far her own experience is embedded in the fictional stories she tells. So for those of you that want to Google Rachel Cusk Norfolk House, you will find that there is this amazing multi-million-pound house that Rachel Cusk and her partner lived in on the Norfolk coast that resembles very closely the house that's described in Second Place. There is a lot of the experience that drives Second Place just as much as the trilogy that I've previously mentioned, that is clearly Rachel Cusk's experience. In fact, I have a friend who refused and got very angry, refused to read Outline, precisely because his best friend was worked for the British Council in Athens and was very upset that Rachel Cusk arrived, took a seminar, and then put it all in a book. If that sounds like somebody familiarly talking about what Lawrence used to do, then I think that's part of what's at stake with the ethics of this writing. We'll talk about that again in a moment. So Cusk uses her own experience and represents it often lightly fictionalized in her novels and other writing. And this has been problematic for her in the past when she wrote about the experience of being a mother and the experience of her divorce, when she was very upset that because she'd been the breadwinner, she still nonetheless didn't think that she should be giving money to her ex-husband and supporting him in the manner to which he'd become accustomed. There was quite a furore around Rachel's discussion of these issues, just as there was a furore around her writing about being a mother early in the 2000s. So again, Rachel very much embedded in an idea of what's it like to be a woman in the 20th century, often to think things to quite strong and extreme points about that woman's experience, and then gradually to push it into a fictionalized mode that is continually, as with Lawrence, as with Lessing, as with Ginsberg, trying to think of a new way to express those experiences and challenges. I mentioned already that there's this question of autofiction and the way that one's personal experience gets expressed in work of the contemporary period, and that's a characteristic of really 21st century writing, which has moved beyond that moment in the 80s and 90s when we had an explosion of literary biography, when we had the emergence of prizes for biography in the 70s and 80s. If you think of the great names of biography, the Richard Ellmans, the Michael Holroyds, those people who really moved forward and created the genre of literary biography, that impetus continued into the 21st century, but has in some ways shifted. That ways that we write literary biography became biographical fiction, became fictional biography. Think of Helen Dunmore's Zena in Darkness. There's a bundle of these texts in the late 90s and early 20th century that made a shift from being literary biography to fictionalized biographies, where where the key figure, the writer, was often a character. I mean, I love Helen Dunmore's Xena in Darkness. I think it's a really interesting book. I had a PhD from 2000 to 2008 who was working on precisely this issue of the emergence and this sudden emergence, really, of fictionalized biography and biographical fictions. So there was something going on there in the earlier part of the 21st century, which was to do with people writing biography in new ways and people writing fiction about real people in new ways and people writing about their own experience in new ways. And this coalesces as we move through the early part of the 21st century into these currents that we're calling autofiction and metamodernism. And that's where we might pick up something like Alison MacLeod's Tenderness. And very briefly, because I promised I'd say something in passing, Francis Wilson's Burning Man. Francis Wilson's Burning Man might be okay if it were a novel. It's a problem that it establishes itself as a biography, as Jonathan's made very clear in his excellent review in the journal. Alison MacLeod's Tenderness does establish itself as a novel, but includes a large straight quotation of the Lady Chatterley trial, the Rolfe transcript and actually the formal transcript of the trial of Penguin Books in the early 1960s. That comes into this novel. It's a really big chunk of the novel towards the end. She has quite a lot of Lawrence sprinkled through the novel, particularly the short story in both of its versions, England, My England, and a number of Lawrence letters and poems are in here. Lawrence is a character in here, and the focus of the Lawrence segment of the novel is indeed the time that he spent in Gretham on the Downs with the Maynell family. He was lent a cottage there and stayed in that small community for a period of I think six to 9 months. Somebody will remind me how long they were there. So there's Lawrence there in Gretham with Frida, with E.M. Forster, with John Middleton Murray, with a visit from Bertie Russell. All of that is translated into a fictional representation that nonetheless quotes from the different recollections and letters and other things that people have said about that period. So we have the real Lawrence in that. Alongside that, the story spins out into the 1950s, into America, to the United States, and tracks Jackie Kennedy. Jackie Kennedy, it turns out, is an avid reader and sneaks along to the trial of Lady Chatterley's lover that takes place in New York prior to, in fact, the trial in the UK. So she goes along because she's fascinated by Lady Chatterley's lover and has this kind of suppressed or kind of hidden affection for Lawrence and for literature and for this life that somehow she didn't have. But she's photographed by an FBI agent while she's at the trial of the American publication of Lady Chatterley's Lover, the Barney Rossett publication. And this leads into a kind of a major plot whereby J. Edgar Hoover, who is desperately trying to prevent the election of JFK to the presidency of the United States, tries to implicate Jackie Kennedy in the promotion of this dirty book, of this immorality, which he sees as part of a Cold War plot on behalf of the Soviet Russia to destabilize the moral core of American society. So Jackie Kennedy befriends Lionel Trilling, as you do, and they meet for lunch at Cape Cod and talk about Lawrence and the importance of literature. So we've got the Lawrence bit in Gretham. We've got Jackie Kennedy and the FBI and the suppression of Lawrence in the States. We've got the account of the, I mean, it's absolutely verbatim mostly, account of the trial of Lady Chatterley at Penguin Books, about which I've written elsewhere. So those three aspects of the novel are an important account of the impact of the novel, the importance of the novel. And this stretching into the US context is to try and understand something of the immensity of what that novel achieved, of the way that its impact resonated throughout the century, across generations of readers and across different nations. What's also actually the bit that most fascinated me about the novel is that it reads Lawrence's experience in Gresham for two particular important facts. The first is that Lawrence wrote England, My England, and in that short story made a representation of Madeline Meynell, who lived in the next cottage along, and her husband as Egbert and Winifred, I think it is, in the England, My England story. Egbert, as some of you will remember, dies in horrific and gruesome circumstances in the trenches in Flanders. In the first version, it's bad enough and he dies. In the second version, his face is cut off, and it's really one of the most violent and unpleasant scenes in all of Lawrence's writing. Unfortunately, the people who he represents in that story, the Meynell family, were unaware until it was published that he was going to do that to them, and were deeply hurt and wounded by this experience, not least when the man who becomes Egbert did actually die in the trenches just as the short story was published. And they felt that this story had been this tremendous betrayal, but also that in some uncanny way, it willed the destruction of this individual. What the novel then does, and I didn't know this fact, so this is the thing that really blew me away, was in spinning over to the trial. It turns out that some of you will probably remember from the trial, there was a woman called Bernardine Wall, who was a witness at the trial, who was a 21-year-old who had just graduated from Cambridge University. And this is absolutely true. She stands up and she talks about getting a 2-1, and that she really enjoyed reading Lady Chatterley, and that she didn't feel that she'd been depraved and corrupted. The novel makes her a character and builds a backstory to Bernardine Wall, but the bit that isn't fictional, there is a fictional bit where she goes into the tower of the library at Cambridge and loses her virginity while reading Lady Chatterley's Lover. But the bit that isn't fictional is that she's the granddaughter of the character Madeline, of Madeline Meynell. She's the granddaughter of the woman who's represented in the short story. And she and her family have obviously never talked about and have tried to forget about their experience and implication in Lawrence's great betrayal after he came to stay with them. So the weight of the novel is then that Rubinstein, the solicitor who's trying to defend Lawrence, has to persuade the Meynells to allow their granddaughter, Bernardine Wall, to witness at the trial. And so part of the payoff of the novel is that there is this recovery, that in fact they decide that it's more important, and more important than that, that Bernardine herself decides that it's important to witness on behalf of Lawrence and show up at the trial. And so that was amazing and wonderful, and a fact that I was unaware of it. And it's also quite an odd story. The other thing that Alison MacLeod's doing is arguing very strongly that Rosalind Baines, who also appears as a walk-on figure during the time down at Gresham in Surrey, was actually the primary model for Lady Chatterley, for Constance Chatterley herself. And the other thing that's woven through this book is this relationship that very briefly comes to fruition in Italy in the early 1920s, just for a few days, but from which Lawrence walks away. And one of the perhaps less convincing elements of this book is Alison MacLeod's attempt to celebrate that kind of unknown relationship and to speculate about that unknown relationship and to place Rosalind Baines at the centre of Lady Chatterley as the source for Constance Chatterley. Obviously, that runs directly contrary to Annabel Abser's account, which makes Frida the original Lady Chatterley. Which leads me to the theoretical question. I'm sorry for that rather long account of the novel, but I kind of needed to set that up because it takes us again into where I think it gets really interesting, which is what's the relation of real people to fictional texts in the contemporary moment? Why is it that we have this proliferation of returns to characters and attempts to fictionalize the biography? And what are the questions that arise? And here's another staggering coincidence. One of the most important pieces of legal precedent in the United States, and Keith will be able to correct me on this momentarily, was a case that occurred, I might have to look for the actual dates here, but I think it's in 1974. But there's a case about Jackie Kennedy. Jackie Kennedy was, in her own time, some of you may remember, very much the Princess Diana of the age. She was pursued relentlessly by paparazzi, by newspapers. She had very little privacy, to the extent that there was one particular cameraman who, for a period of 10 years, effectively stalked Jackie Kennedy after the death of JFK. And a famous case came into the courts which defined the limits of privacy. It defined how personhood might be protected from intrusion and from being possessed or abused by other people. I'm just looking for the note where I've got the list of what happens. There's a super article by a guy called Paul Ekin, which is about the ethics of life writing and how the way in which privacy is defined is central to how we think of what it is to be a self. And how, for the most part, privacy is defined in terms, in some ways, that it relates to you as an individual, that ethically it's associated with something that is intrinsic to you and that shouldn't be intruded upon. People shouldn't tell stories that you don't want them to tell, that you should be libeled, and that your selfhood shouldn't be appropriated by somebody else. Now, one of the arguments around writing and writing about fictional characters, or writing biography, is that you are inevitably intruding upon the privacy of the person about whom you're writing. One of the reasons that Francis Wilson's book is upsetting is that it does misrepresent and speculate about people without making clear when it is making stuff up. She says the biographer's job is to edit. She says that there's that extraordinary quote that Jonathan pulls out in his review as well. Where have I got your quote, Jonathan? When she talks about that she can edit the facts, I believe, is one of the things that she says. And she says that this is what biographers do. That, in fact, is not what biographers do. What Ekin argues is that once you novelize a biography, you're moving into a very suspect ethical area. Okay, so it's okay to write a novel, but not to novelize a fictional account, that ethically that intrudes upon or breaks your compact or your ethical responsibility to the object of the story. Which leads me to what I'll make the final kind of thing of what I'm trying to throw out, which is John Worthen's article about life writing, the writing lives in the recent Lawrentian context, which I thought is a marvelous short piece of writing about how Lawrence uses different people and himself in his own fictions. And I do recommend you have a look at this, because what John effectively argues is that, yes, people got very upset when they saw themselves represented in Lawrence's texts. And yes, biographers routinely root through the fictional texts to understand something of the real dynamics of the people who've been represented, not least the real dynamics of Lawrence's own life. But what John suggests, that I think is a really pithy suggestion, is that in fact what Lawrence is doing is talking about the possibility and potentiality within that character at that particular moment, within that person, within himself, if you like, if he carried along this road or if he continued to live in this way. So they are not so much representations as extensions and perpetuations or proliferations, if you like, of a person in the contemporary moment under different pressures that allow for the exploration of what might have happened, what could have happened, the person that might have been, as a way of exploring the morality, if you like, of a particular experience or a particular living in the world. And that allows me to kind of loop back to Rachel Cusk, because I think that's so much what she is doing in her appropriation, if you like, of the Mabel Luhan story. Rachel Cusk writes in second place about a woman called M, who invites an artist called L to come and stay at her lovely house on the Norfolk, I believe it's Norfolk coast. I'm projecting there, I'm just putting Rachel Cusk in the house. It doesn't actually specify. And so I hope you've all read Keith's review of this, which perfectly elucidates with great concision how much of that is taken from Mabel Luhan's Lorenzo in Taos, the account of Lawrence's time in New Mexico and of their interactions. Now, what it seems to me to do is that this story, this second place, is actually doing to Lawrence and particularly to Mabel Luhan what Lawrence himself did to his experience and to those fictional characters that he represents and that John Worthen has so elegantly thought about. What she does is inscribe herself in a parallel situation. She inscribes a female character who resonates both with Mabel and with Rachel Cusk, and explores what would happen if this L, who becomes a painter, comes and stays in the contemporary moment in this place. And so she is exploring the potentialities of these kind of alternate selves, the possibilities of these people that are herself and are not at the same time. And I suppose what I'm trying in my mind to bring together is how so much of these contemporary autofictions, autobiographical fictions, biographical fictions, particularly within this period of the 21st century, are trying to tussle with that ethical and moral question about how to understand experience in the world, but they're also layering it with these previous versions. It's a term that Lee Jenkins brings up, is the term palimpsest, which she brings out of Jeanette. The idea that when she looks at H.D., Richard Aldington, and Lawrence writing about a short period of time in Mecklenburg Square, they're each writing about the same moment, and somehow those three novels, H.D.'s Bid Me to Live, Lawrence's Aaron's Rod, I think it is, and what's the Death of a Hero, are in some ways the same text, that we can't ever think anymore about discrete and singular texts, but we must always think about texts as an intertextual network and as a palimpsest network. And so the final kind of layer to this is, of course, how we think about manuscripts and the emergence again over the last 20 years of a new way of thinking about what a text is, genetic criticism, and the attempt that has been perhaps most nobly and obviously achieved by Chris Polnitz with the poems, which is to try to somehow to keep in tension multiple versions of a text, to show the dynamic of the thinking that's behind an experience or the emergence of a writing of a text. So all of these things seem to me a model, and they're things that I'm thinking about at the moment and that I'm going to spend the next 6 months thinking about. And so that's my period of free association over. And so I'm going to open now to whatever questions you might have, because I'm thinking that wasn't maybe all that clear. Right, so Keith's got his hand up, so I'll go straight to Keith. And you're muted. There we go.
Couple of comments and a question.
I'm not hearing you, so I need very quickly to find out what my problem is. So talk among yourselves
Can
for
other
one
people hear?
moment while I see why I can't hear you, because that's not great. I think I've seen how I can do it. Can you speak to me again, Keith?
Can you hear me now?
No, still not getting it. Let me see. Somebody would tell. Where can I find some settings, Kate?
Is it to do with your headphones, do you
because
think?
I can't hear you, so even if you were telling me where your settings were, that's not great. I'm in a bit of a pickle because I can't hear. Okay, I'll try to unplug the headphones. Right. Now.
Can you hear us now?
Anybody?
We can hear you.
Can you hear us?
Can somebody speak?
Hello?
Yes,
Hello.
I'm still not
Clearly
hearing,
can't.
unfortunately. This is profoundly embarrassing. Okay, I'm going to leave the meeting and come back. So talk among yourselves, and Kate, can you let me in? And hopefully I can adjust my settings as I come back in. How do I leave the meeting?
Bottom right hand corner. Whoops.
Should I leave out of sheer embarrassment? His two children operate from there to me every day perfectly.
Well, should we carry on?
Yeah, let's carry on talking. So who'd like to step forward?
I think Keith was going to say
Keith,
something.
yes.
Well, but I'd like to,
Please.
can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, please. Yeah.
I'd like to share this with Sean. But one of the things, and I will say it again when he returns, what he's telling us about Rachel Cusk and Alison MacLeod makes me think of Peter Preston, who left us over 10 years ago, and whose project was Lawrence's appearance in and impact on English writers after him, and how he would have had a chapter on Rachel Cusk, and certainly talked about Alison MacLeod, and how sorely we miss Peter Preston.
Was Keith? Can you hear me? You're talking about Peter Preston because it's interesting. One of the books I reached for in thinking about the talk today, I thought I'll go back to Peter, and I just had such a reading Peter's work on this, and his mention of the monograph that he never wrote, which was about Lawrence in contemporary writing, and I do think we should maybe explore where some of his notes are for that, because he did immense amounts of work on Lawrence in the contemporary that would be worth exploring.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was saying, and how your project, especially with Cusk and MacLeod, made me think about that. To a brief other point, it's very nice that you have recorded this, because believe me, you will be able to use it as you turn this into inimitable prose. It's already inimitable prose. A question: you talked a lot about Tenderness. I've read about the novel. part of it sounds rather cheesy, as Americans would say, the Jackie Kennedy bit. Do you recommend it as a novel as opposed to something to read for people who are engaged in D.H. Lawrence?
Yeah, oddly enough, I do recommend it. I was very perplexed when I first read it and very unsure about it, which either means that it's terrible or something going on. And I do think that the range of different things that she's trying to achieve and the grandeur of her ambition, which is to see the importance of this novel from so many different perspectives. She's holding up a whole idea of its implication for the 21st century, for the 20th century, and in some ways making the case for its kind of it being the most important novel of the century, and at the same time trying to read that through, in a quite conventional way, the experience of particular individuals. In some ways, the bit that works worst is her attempt to represent Lawrence in Gretton, and there's a paradox to being quite sympathetic to the Maynolds, but at the same time doing exactly what she's criticizing Lawrence for in excavating the private life of Jackie Kennedy and speculating about that. And as with all these people who write about Frida, I just don't think that Frida's mind necessarily, as Lawrence was dying, was, oh, maybe I should give him a blowjob. You know what? I don't quite. I mean, and would Frida use the word fellate? I mean, I'm just asking. John, do you think? So yeah, that really upset me early on, but in fact, the novel did persuade me. And the other thing, spoiler alert, is that there's this marvelous closing scene where she speculates about Connie and Oliver Mellors in Canada, and that's a very rich scene and takes things to a further thing. And this is again this question of taking fictional characters and exploiting them further, which is rather wonderful. Okay,
Terry, I think you've got your hand up.
So, Sean, is the implication then of what you're saying that really, in reading these books, we really shouldn't be looking for insights into the original characters at all, that in fact we shouldn't be looking for the join of what was really true and what is the extension of what could have been possible, that actually the join is not the point? Is that true?
I tell you what, Terry, I wish I'd put it like that, because that was really incisive. Yeah, it's the idea that that yes, it's fun to explore that and so forth, but it's certainly not about achieving some kind of true sense of any of these people, because we're beyond that sense of what a person is. That's part of what the argument is that maybe I haven't quite encapsulated yet, is that we're beyond that idea of a character, of the consistency of a character, of the singularity of an individual. The other way of thinking about the ethics of all this is to say, if we talk about privacy as, if we talk about identity as relational, I sent John Worthen a document about this earlier from Coleridge and from Eakin, from Larry Longridge. If we think about the way that, in fact, you can't disentangle yourself from other people. One of the great things about people writing about Frida is that we have no Lawrence if we don't have Frida. I think everybody who's written about Frida and about Lawrence would acknowledge that there's this intense relationship between them, and around them so much other stuff orbits. But, and this is the paradox demonstrated very fully by Annabel Abbs's book, any Frida that we have ends up being a palimpsest of some literary version of her at some different stage in her life that Lawrence might have put into a book, or she wrote about herself subsequently. So there is no truth of Frida other than the relational truth. And I think that's something that's important, is that we move into a different idea of selfhood if we start thinking about these novels in a different way. And certainly with Cusk, I think she's projecting beyond any of the kind of limits of character either of Lawrence or of Mabel Luhan or of Lorenzo and Tass. So yes, I think you put that really well. I'm glad it's recorded.
And isn't that actually the case with Lawrence's characters based on real people? That in fact, their novels, so they're part of a drama and they're not individual characters that represent some real people. They're actually a position, as it were. Well, a structure of feeling, part of a dynamic structure that relates to other characters. So he's making a drama based on this material, but actually the drama is the important thing, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's what John gets at in his piece about writing lives as well, that we shouldn't, I mean, notwithstanding that he's a biographer, of course, but that we shouldn't be pursuing real people into these dramas. We should be thinking about the drama in and of itself. I mean, I think England, My England is a tremendous story, but how would I have felt if I'd been Madeleine Maynell? I don't know. It's and that's where some of the ethics come in. And of course, he pissed so many people. Jesse Chambers, Otto Lang Morel, all of these people were upset to the point of libel, and that's clearly something that needs putting in the mix as well. But no, I'm with you that these are fictional characters. My father wants to speak,
and he must. Why do you think that Lawrence simply didn't at least give other names to known people?
No, he did. I mean, the problem is that is the extent to which you recognize yourself. And often these are
names were even.
Oddly enough, Barbara, who is the daughter of Madeline, is the only character in England, My England, I think, who does remain with her own name, and she's the mother of Bernardine Wall. No, I mean, the problem is how some of them are not even lightly disguised. Obviously, it's the extent to which they're very easily recognizable. But as John argued, and as I think Terry's saying now as well, they're extrapolations. They're seizing an idea of a person in a moment of relationship and seeing where that goes.
Kate, you've got your hand up.
I was just going to say that I read that Rachel Cusk said that she regretted saying that she had based second place on Mabel Dodge Luhan's memoir. And I wondered why she even did that, because, I mean, I really enjoyed Second Place. I thought it was a really interesting book about, well, more for me about being an older woman or a mother-daughter relationship. And also this idea of like somebody who can offer, who a host offering a home to somebody, and then the kind of what they expect in return. Why wasn't the character grateful for everything that she'd given him? But I just really did not see the character that she created as Lawrence. I mean, I know you might have a bit of an idealized view of Lawrence, but I still felt that character that she created, especially when he arrived with all his bags of luggage, he was very extravagant character. He was very bothered about image, and to me that was nothing like Lawrence at all. So I didn't really understand why. So this is, I mean, because obviously she's not the same as Lawrence, who wrote about people he knew. She didn't know Lawrence, so I didn't see why she needed that.
It's interesting because I think it's a story. A novel that I talk about a lot is a novel by a woman called Patricia Dunker called Hallucinating Foucault, which is a fun novel from the mid-90s about a PhD student who is studying the work of Paul Michel. Paul Michel is an entirely imaginary French novelist from the same period as Michel Foucault's life. Michel Foucault's real name is in fact Paul Michel Foucault. And so what Dunker has done is create a novelist out of certain tendencies that are there within Foucault's own work. This PhD student eventually helps the author to escape from an asylum and runs off to the south of France with him, where all kinds of strange things happen. But what I think is important about the story is that it's pushing part of Michel Foucault into an imaginary character that allows you to explore your relation to particular ideas within Foucault. So I think what Cusk is doing, given the lineage of her attention and affection and celebration of Lawrence, is trying to think about what it would be like to write about a dominant artistic figure who imposes himself in ways that reproduce some of the ways, the difficult ways in which a Lawrence figure imposes himself, either in the real history, but as Terry has just been saying, in reality, it's more about in a fictional scenario, about the potentiality of what happens when you get to meet somebody who's been artistically that important to you. I mean, I did work, I had a conversation with the British Council with Rachel Cusk myself a number of years ago, and it was excruciating. I mean, she was lovely, but she didn't want to perform Rachel Cusk. She was so austere. It was really strange. It was not like any author conversation I'd ever had, and it was really, I think I get the impression it was quite traumatic for both of us. It was so I think there's a profound integrity to the way that Rachel approaches her place in the world and thinking about it. And so I think at some points there's a kind of technical, I'm sorry we didn't talk more about the plot, but yeah, there's a kind of technical aspect to her thinking about structures and writing.
Do we have some more comments, please? I'd like to keep this open till, say, past. So we've got another 15 minutes. So
I have
please.
a question, please.
Yeah, Nala. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks. Sean, how do you think these writers, contemporary writers, which you classified inside the genre of metamodernism, are different from Lawrence modernism and postmodernism in the same trend and the same way of registering day-to-day experiences?
Okay, I didn't coin the term metamodernism, so I hope I haven't butchered it in talking about it. It's a term that Peter Vermeulen and a number of critics have used because academics like to try to categorize work. I find it useful in the sense that beyond what we had in modernism, there is a metafictional and a reflexive aspect to what these writers are doing, that there's a self-consciousness and often the insertion of themselves explicitly into the narratives. That's about as far as I would go in wanting to talk about metamodernism, because my frank answer is that I don't know enough about the discussions that are taking place about metamodernism. It's a new term that I've come across in the last year or two. Jeff will correct me as to when it's emerged. And just like we went through post-humanism, and there was a writing that has since occupied the space of thinking about post-human or the Anthropocene, metamodernism seems to me a relatively recent coinage that we may not as yet be settled as to its full content. I mean, Jeff, do you have anything on metamodernism?
Thank you about this part, about the metamodernism, but the other part actually, which is the core of my question, how are these contemporary writers different from Lawrence in registering the day-to-day experiences? Apart from, for instance, I would say we have now in our present world different movements, different literary movements, cultural movements, experiences, industrial revolutions, and for instance, I don't know, inventions every day on a day-to-day basis. How would they, apart from all of this, would they be different in this kind of trend, the trend of writing that utilizes only words and experiences of people around you?
I think the comparison with Lawrence, and I'll come back to Jeff, who's going to tell us about metamodernism. Thanks, Jeff. The comparison with Lawrence, I think, is that if you follow and track Lawrence's career, no book is like the previous book. His voices are multiple. His development is never within any kind of aesthetic logic. He surprises with each new form. He's kind of finished with what he's just done, and he does something different.
He's unpredictable.
So yeah, and I think that again is the integrity of his artistic credo and his way of being in the world. So I think there are very few people, and I think this is to go back to Kate's comment about this L character in second place. There are very few people who can conceivably live that way. I mean, it's an extraordinary life. That's why we obsess. That's why we're interested in Lawrence, because quite apart from the remarkable aesthetic and literary achievements, what kind of life was that in the intensity and it's coming from Eastwood and the background that he came from to live in that way is remarkable. And so I think there are very few people that I know of in the contemporary kind of writing scene who live in that way. The people that we would probably start to think of, I mean, it's not a good parallel, but Salman Rushdie has the post-colonial writers like Salman Rushdie, refugee writers, traveling writers, have exemplified some of that experience. The writers of Black experience have often exemplified that experience. So I would start to spread my kind of range beyond kind of British Anglophone writing, I think, in trying to find somebody who's living in a way that they're expressing as intensely as Lawrence, and is therefore so different from themselves. Actually, the other writer in contemporary Britain who I might think of would be Qureshi. Oddly enough, Hanif Qureshi, who writes in many different genres, and no two books are similar one from another. Quite an unusual progression as a writer.
Yeah, he brings from another culture as well. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the answer. Very enriching.
I'll come back to Keith, but Jeff, I'm not hearing you, Jeff. Is it just me?
How's that?
Perfect.
Okay, so when I take out the earplugs, then it works. So, but that means that means that you're very, very quiet now. Again, we've gone back to the volume problem at the beginning. But anyway, I'll press on just to say that yeah, I mean, I can't actually. I'm not familiar with metamodernism. I haven't read the Peter Vermeulen piece, was it, that you mentioned? But you know, I mean, just from that description of it, I mean, it did seem to me kind of perilously close to postmodernism, as we used to refer to that, or even to historiographic metafiction. Remember that one? And you know, there are certain. So really, that's an area of, you know, a kind of area of theory. Those distinctions obviously need to be made. But can I just segue into, as I've failed to help on metamodernism, can I segue into what I was thinking? I mean, it was fascinating account of those novels. I mean, I haven't read the latest Rachel Cusk, but I love the trilogy. I think it's an amazing and important piece of work, you know. But I was thinking about that in relation to your initial comments about structure of feeling. You didn't. I was wondering if you were going to come back to that, and you didn't really come back very much to that at the end. And I was wondering really about how, you know, whether your argument was about the importance of kind of reflexive autofiction as in itself a new structure of feeling, or whether autofiction was being used to examine the new structure of feeling. You know, there are different levels of argument there. And one thing that I was fascinated by, I found myself wondering whether structure of feeling is always, as it seemed to be for Williams in his comments about Cambridge, whether it's always examining something, whether it's about examining something that's already there and just needs to be brought to the surface. You know, Williams said, I don't understand the language they're using, but I need to try to excavate this and understand it. Or is there something about structure feeling, and I think you touched on this with Williams as well, it's always emergent, that it's something new that's emerging. And what's really exciting about that, what was really exciting about that concept, is that it's a way of trying to kind of pinpoint and talk about something that is just emerging, you know. And I think that Rachel Cusk is important for that, because she writes in a way, she's one of those writers who, you know, will say things and you'll say, as a reader, you know, you'll say, wow, can you say that? and that seemed to be the tenor of John's article about women in love as well, that readers, when they first read Women in Love, said, can you say that? Can that be said? And that's really, that seems to me what's interesting about Structure Feeling, is that you kind of, you pick up on something that's emerging, you know, which is also William's concept as well, isn't it? And you know, that makes me think, as well as the, you know, the contemporary writers that you mentioned, I was thinking as well about someone like Patricia Lockwood or Nell Zink, you know, because they are writers to me now, who, especially Patricia Lockwood, you know, where I read them and I think, wow, you know, can that be said? This is, in other words, this is a new structure of feeling, which is registering things, you know, that haven't been registered before.
You're absolutely right. And for Williams, it is about newness, and it is about the struggle for something to emerge. And so in that sense, it's very much more Cusk than it is MacLeod, I think. I don't think there's anything kind of beyond its ambition that's desperately new about what Alison MacLeod's doing. I mean, it's interesting in the way it knits together the fictional and the real and whatever, but it's not new in the same way. But I do think Cusk is exploring, something that's about a different idea of what a self is, which I think is what Doris Lessing does. I think is what Lawrence does all the time. And sometimes maybe you only kind of do that once or twice in a career. I mean, her earlier work, she gets upset when you say her earlier work was quite conventional, but it was. And the sudden things that she's doing in the Outline trilogy, and I think again with Second Place, deserve revisiting and revisiting, because you're absolutely right. It's not only can you do that, it's also what's that? What is it that's happened here? And what was really interesting was to teach Cusk this year for the first time in our contemporary fiction module at Nottingham, and to teach Outline, and how excited the students were. It was like, this is something that they could immediately see was different. And it was its difference and its newness from, and these are finalist students, so they have a fair kind of range of reading across the canon and the century. And this was like, wow, this is distinct. And they were able to identify with it. I suppose a broader argument would be about all these questions of what kind of selves we have in the contemporary world, in the period with the way now reality TV, with the social media, all of these things, which don't particularly impinge on Rachel Cusk's world at all, in the worlds that she creates. But nonetheless, I think she's a writer who is writing about the complexity of selfhood in this current moment. Keith.
Yes, I've been thinking about novels about literary figures myself, because I am a third of the way through the wonderful, wonderful Hamnet. One of the, from 2020, where there are no ethical issues because it's about Shakespeare and his family, and so little is known. And it's also quite clear that the novelist is doing something very speculative in many ways, although it's wonderfully situated in the late 16th century. A couple of thoughts about other reasons, though, for the prevalence of this kind of fiction. First of all, it gives the novelist a built-in plot. She doesn't have to make something up. He doesn't have to make something up. And secondarily, it gives the novel a strong point of interest. It's about Lawrence. It's about Shakespeare. I'd never heard of this Northern Irish woman whose name I can't even think of. She is honored. She has been honored. But her other novels, I take it, aren't about literary figures. This is the one where she really leaped forward into cultural consciousness, and a great success because it's about Shakespeare.
Yeah. I think Lee Jenkins is writing about, she's doing some work on biofiction again now, so it'll be interesting. I've had a lovely exchange with Lee on some emails because obviously I saw the work that she's doing, so I'm quite excited to see where she's taking that.
We still have 3 or 4 minutes left. So
I was noticing the comment in the chat about novels with pages of notes at the end. There was a vogue in novels for a while to make acknowledgements of different historical figures and friends and notes at the end. Ian McEwan used to do it for a while, but certainly the odd thing about Tenderness, which is very interesting at the level of ethics, I think, is that there are literally, I'm not sure if this was said, but there are literally probably 20 or 30 pages of notes showing where the different sources are, so that you can see where she's used something that's in the public domain or as a story. And she does quite literally just transcribe loads of the trial. And I worked a lot on the trial, and it's like, oh, this isn't a novel. You've cut and pasted here. So initially that was a bit weird as well, but I can see why she did it, because you couldn't fictionalize what goes on in the courtroom of the Old Bailey when they're looking at Lady Chatterley. I mean, it's a remarkable kind of event, and I think MacLeod probably looked at it and just, okay, she gets this Bernardine Wall thing, which is really nice, and she gets Forster, who's a character from the start of the book, but yeah, she's just said, actually, you can't make this stuff up, which is another kind of element of this kind of docu-fiction genre that's emergent as well. The other novel that I was thinking about alongside this was maybe Ali Smith's trilogy. It's a quartet, isn't it? In Spring, in Ali Smith, she actually has a character who's a documentary filmmaker, and there's reflection there upon how do you tell, because he's done a documentary film about Bloody Sunday, I think, about the Irish Troubles, and that embeds within the novel this question about how you tell a historical story, and the kind of ethical and narrative challenges that you have, and how new forms of documentary emerge at different periods as we understand how stories relate to truth at different periods. I mean, that was something I was reading in putting all this together, was that, people talk about the Lawrence that we needed in the 1970s and the Lawrence of the 1990s, and the Lawrence of the 2020s is a different Lawrence again. In this kind of extrapolation that we face.
Well, thank you very, very much. The most wonderful evening, and oh gosh, so much to think about, and all these many works that have been talked about. Thank you very much. Shall we all give a round of applause, please, everybody?
Thank you.